Want to welcome everyone to the weekly history seminar of the National History Center and the Woodrow Wilson Center. We want to thank everyone who has helped to organize the session. We want especially to recognize Sonia Michel, as a co-organizer of the seminar, and I want to point out that we have a past president of the American Historical Association with us, Linda Kerber. Let's begin, as we usually do, with the ritual of letting everyone introduce himself, herself, with the institutional affiliation.
Ross Johnson, Wilson Center.
Yeah, let's wait for the...
There we go. Once again, Ross Johnson, Wilson Center.
John Carlin, Office of the Historian, Department of State.
Miriam House Cunningham, the National History Center.
Bob Hathaway, Wilson Center.
Tom Hughes, currently at the German Historical Institute, but I was DCM in London in 1969-70.
Sonia Michel, Wilson Center.
Oksana Likarenko, Kennan Institute School of.
Marjorie Spruill, fellow at the Wilson Center and professor at the University of South Carolina.
Don Wolfensberger with the Congress Project here at the Wilson Center.
Vicki Harrison, I'm here keeping the speaker company.
Alessandra Bitumi, I'm Fulbright Scholar and Fellow at the Wilson Center.
Joseph Soon, Scholar at the Woodrow Wilson and Professor at Georgetown University.
Roy Matthews, retired professor of the Humanities Department and Department of History, Michigan State University.
This is Francisco Rodriguez, a postdoctoral writer in George Washington University.
Anita Jones, retired from the AHA.
Chandler McDonald, Department of State.
Ken McDonald, former CIA historian.
Linda Kerber, University of Iowa.
Ron Harrison, University of Oxford.
I will say just a very brief word about Sir Brian Harrison. His first book is the one that I suppose made Brian famous throughout the world. This is Drink and the Victorians. And I thought we could celebrate this in a very particular way by presenting Brian this afternoon with a bottle of gin. So I tried. I honestly did. On my long walk over to the Woodrow Wilson Center to find there was not a gin shop in sight. So I failed in my mission, but you'll know that the thought was there. Many other books, books on feminism, books on anti-feminism, and above all, the last two volumes in the new Oxford History of England. I believe the only one in the series that has two volumes rather than one. And I imagine that this has happened because Brian Harrison is probably one of the editors of the series. Am I?
No.
Oh, okay. I'm wrong about that. Then he does have a special prestige and status to be able to have two volumes in the Oxford History of England. He also, as everyone will know, is the editor of the new Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, for which he was knighted. He has the reputation of being the only person who has actually read all of the D&B, every page from beginning to end. Sir Brian Harrison on the special relationship.
I was sitting up in bed this morning wondering quite how to introduce this seminar, and I was reading Chris Mullin's book, Decline and Fall. Some of you may know it. Chris Mullin's not a famous politician, but he's a very entertaining backbench Labour MP, and he's published these diaries, which are having a wide circulation. And suddenly I lighted upon page 301, which seemed to me a suitable beginning for this seminar. He's talking about Barack Obama's inauguration on the 20th of January 2009. He says, the event was witnessed by vast cheering crowds stretching from the steps of the Capitol away down the Mall as far as the eye could see. Even here, that is in the House of Commons, as the hour drew near, the excitement was palpable. All over the building, members, Tory and Labour alike, security guards and the tea room staff clustered around TV sets to bear witness. There were some nice moments. None nicer than when George and Laura Bush were seen off the premises, escorted by the Obamas to the helicopter that whisked them away on the first leg of their journey home to Texas. He goes on to say, expectations are so high they cannot possibly be fulfilled, but it was a moment to savour. Well, that's an introduction to the fact that as far as Britain is concerned, there certainly is a special relationship in the sense that there's intense interest, even now, in everything that happens in the United States, particularly in the political system. Now, you've had a circular of the index to my two books in the New Oxford History of England. 11 volumes in the series have so far been published out of 17. And the first of mine, which covers the period 1951 to 1970, is called Seeking a Role, and the second volume is called Finding a Role, which covers the period from 1970 to 1990. And these 4 pages are extracts from the indexes to those 2 volumes, and you'll see that the USA has a huge entry in both. In Seeking a Role, it has 3.5 columns. Compare 1 column for the Commonwealth, a third of a column for the USSR. In Finding a Role, it's got, again, 3.5 columns, with half a column for the Commonwealth, and less than a quarter of a column for the USSR. And even with the EU, EEC, it's only got 2 columns. Now, the United States occupies the largest entry in both volumes without any doubt. And that led me to think that this would be a good introduction to describing quite why the entry is so large in both volumes. I'll discuss only 5 of the subheadings that you see on these lists: economic aspects, political aspects, moral and religious aspects, cultural aspects, and leading on to the special relationship itself. And then I'll finish with a few generalizations about all 5 aspects. First of all, if one looks at economic aspects, I want to make really 4 points about the United States UK relationship. First of all, the United States was extremely prominent. Can you hear me, or do I need to use this thing? Right, okay. Do I need to switch it on, or
it's on? But
does it work?
There,
is it working? Is that better?
There we go.
Sorry about that. Of the United States manufacturing investments in the whole of Europe. It's true that there have been subsequently mounting competition to the United States as a source of investment in the United Kingdom, but nonetheless, the United States still had 56% of investment in the UK in 1981, whereas the European Union's share had only risen from 13% to 15%, and Japan's was then only 2%. So you can see, even at that stage, United States investment was extremely important in the UK. By 1987, Japanese UK investment was nearly a third of their investment in the whole of Europe. But in 1986, United States-owned companies produced almost an eighth of the UK's manufacturing output. And not only do they invest in the UK, they set a model for types of behaviour in the economic sphere. For instance, breakfast cereal, fast food, mountain bikes are all American goods which exert a profound influence in the UK when they're imported from the USA. The USA also provides an exemplar for working practices. The idea of the working breakfast is certainly not a British notion. It's an American notion, which was imported in the City of London in the 1960s in banking circles. And the emphasis on productivity generally is very much a matter of hard work and initiative, which mobilizes workaholics. The term workaholic is a term which arrived from the USA, and it's one of the imports in British vocabulary that comes from the United States in many areas. It's more than just a matter of working practices. It's a matter of working technology. Office technology completely supersedes the United Kingdom as far as the production of laptops, computers, and that sort of thing is concerned. The UK was very important in the origination of the computer industry, but it soon lost out to the United States, which mobilized itself to produce office technology in overwhelming quantities. Automation, another American working practice, which starts in America and is imported by the 1950s into the UK, and bank cards, of course, arrive from, again, an American idea which arrives in Britain in the 1960s and 70s. Call centres, headhunters, teleworking, these are all United States terms which one finds entering the UK. So as far as working practice is concerned, the economic sphere is extremely important in UK imports from America. Consumerism, a third dimension of economic aspects of the special relationship. There are two aspects to it, really. The United States pioneers the monitoring of industry and commerce through pressure groups, consumerist pressure groups, on the model of Ralph Nader from the 1950s, but much more importantly through the free market, the ideal of the free market, which actually supersedes any need for, or allegedly supersedes the need for, government organizations monitoring in the interest of the consumer. The free market allegedly looks after the consumer without any need for government intervention. The whole retailing world, which was revolutionized in the United Kingdom, was revolutionized first in the United States, and the terms garden centre, hypermarket, launderette are all American terms introduced into the UK from the United States. And, of course, advertising, commercialisation, the growth of ITV, independent television, at the expense of the BBC, British Broadcasting Corporation, again involves importing American techniques which have a profound influence on the whole world of consumerism. Fluoridated toothpaste, for example, was a very important early example of the impact of advertising on the United Kingdom's retail market, first marketed through ITV advertisements in 1958. But above all, in the economic sphere, the United States has been profoundly important, I don't need to tell you, in inculcating the free market ideal. Not just through the Chicago School of Economists in the 1960s, but through the whole ideal that is epitomized in what's called Thatcherism from 1979, the ideal of entrepreneurship, of privatization, of privatized medicine, and of mass share owning are all American phenomena which lie behind the growth of the free market, which is a major part of the 20th century story in the late 20th century in the UK. The whole philosophy of gambling, which of course is an extreme extension of the free market idea, has not got as far as Las Vegas in the UK, but nonetheless gambling as a recreation was beginning to grow from the early 1960s onwards. The key Thatcherite terms, underclass and workfare, again, are imported from the United States, And this whole emphasis on the free market, which gained such a strength from the advent of Margaret Thatcher in 1979, takes another onward, a forward step in the early 90s with the collapse of the USSR, which naturally then revalidates or validates the alternative. So from the 1990s onwards, both political parties are increasingly moving towards identification with the free market and with a certain sympathy with the United States as an economic influence. So much for the economic aspects. I'll move on to the political aspects, and the first thing to say there is that the political parties in Britain, both of them, have been profoundly influenced by American techniques in politics and by the content of politics, their manifestos, their policies. The United States influences both major parties throughout the British history since 1945, whether Labour or Conservative. The Labour Party tends to identify with American egalitarianism, lack of class feeling, with American optimism, belief in progress, and with liberty. And of course also with the New Deal, which operates as a sort of semi-socialist ideal for the Labour Party, seeing its ideas put into practice. As far as the Conservatives are concerned, what Conservatives like about the United States is, of course, the free market, insofar as the British Conservatives are free marketeers. But they also, of course, identify pretty totally, actually, with American anti-communism. Both parties are not just influenced by American ideals, but also by American campaigning methods. And you can see at any British general election since 1945 the importing of American campaigning methods and utilization of the media, and later on, of course, computing methods and identification of voters for the purpose of influencing them. So the political aspects of the special relationship, as far as the UK is concerned, is very much a matter of the content and the methods of politics. It's also very important, secondly, at the level of the belief in liberty. The Americans identify, of course, with liberty in the British Empire, which is rather embarrassing for the Conservative Party early on, but even they start embracing it by the late 1950s. And, of course, the Labour Party has always had an identification with the opposition or criticism of empire. And so liberty in that dimension is an American influence which is much less embarrassing to the Labour Party than the Conservative Party. But also the defence of minorities, which the United States in many ways pioneers as a set of ideals. The ideal of law centres, for instance, which identify the legal profession with the underprivileged rather than the privileged, is very much an American ideal which gains ground considerably in the 1960s in Britain, as does, of course, the whole ideal of voluntarism and of what the 19th century would have called self-help, the improving the world through non-governmental agencies. I suppose the fourth phase of feminism in Britain in the 1960s is a good example of this pressure group influence from the United States. There had been three earlier phases of feminism in the United Kingdom, but the fourth owed an enormous amount to Betty Friedan and to the whole American feminist movement, so much so that one could say that's a fourth stage in the evolution of feminism in the United Kingdom. The ideal of open government owes something to Scandinavia, but a great deal also to the United States. And I think it's fair to say that Watergate could never have happened in the United Kingdom for two reasons, really. First of all, Watergate couldn't have happened because the British press in the 1970s was much more closed, much less open to a public investigation than the American press was. So that Watergate really set an example of an open press which was extremely influential, I think, and has opened up the British press a great deal. But others would say that, of course, Watergate would never have happened in the UK because the British parliamentary system is so close in its scrutiny of the executive that Nixon would never have shown a sign of getting away with it in the United Kingdom. He would have been rumbled rather earlier, but that's a matter of opinion. I think openness in general is a much more prevalent notion in the United Kingdom than it would have been without American influence. In some ways, this has a downside. There's a rude remark about dumbing down elsewhere in this book. And there's no doubt that the short attention span required by media that are interrupted every 10 minutes by advertisements is one of the factors that's transferred to the United Kingdom and has involved dumbing down. But there's an egalitarian element of dumbing down which I think owes a great deal to the United States, and so the very phrase dumbing down comes from the United States, as does the word soundbite, for example. The third way in which the political influence has been profound of the United States on the UK has been through a belief in the written constitution, and you'll all probably know that we once took a pride in the fact that we didn't have a written constitution. Our political system didn't require such crude attempts at rationality. But that notion was really on the run by the 1960s, and the pressure for institutionalized defense of civil rights, for example, owes a great deal to the admiration for American institutions that really became quite rampant in the 1960s, together with a belief in the congressional committee system as a method of investigating the British executive. Congressional committees were a profound influence on the growth of House of Commons all-party committees from the late 1960s onwards. Federalism was also an American set of values that owed a great deal, or contributed a great deal, to decolonisation and to the structures that the British Empire attempted to erect in the aftermath of the British retreat. The American model was extremely important at that level too, as an influence on the successor structures. I'll move on thirdly then to moral and religious aspects, and there are 2 points I really want to make on that. In a way they're contradictory. At the first sight, the United States seems a religious society where religious institutions are profoundly influential, whereas in the UK they're diminishingly influential, and Britain is a relatively secular society to all appearances by comparison with the United States. And so the United States, as early as much earlier than the 1950s, but still in the 1950s, it's conducting reforming crusades to improve the British, most notably Billy Graham in his expedition in 1954, and the whole pressure towards fundamentalism, which helps to explain the prosperity of evangelicalism as a set of religious attitudes, which is the main story, really, of British Protestantism in the late 20th century. And also, of course, the attack on Darwinism, which is again a growth area, again owes a lot to United States influences, crusading zeal. The moral majority idea never really catches on as a dimension of Thatcherism. British society is too weakly religious to ever establish a moral majority as an important component of the right wing in the United Kingdom, so that dimension of the American influence or moral influence on the United Kingdom doesn't ever really take off, though a lot of people expect that it might in the 1970s. It never actually takes off. On the other hand, the United States has a profound influence on attitudes to personal conduct, if one tries to divorce that from religious ideals, you may have heard of the expression, we don't do God, which was the remark that Campbell, Tony Blair's press advisor, immediately jumped in when somebody started asking Tony Blair a question about his religion. Campbell said, we don't do God. That is, God is not, so to speak, forefront in the vocabulary, the agenda of British politics, but nonetheless, personal morality and changes in personal conduct are a major thread of the 20th century story in Britain, late 20th century story, and the United States has been a profound influence on that. The growth of birth control owed a great deal to Margaret Sanger and to the whole early 20th century movement of the birth control pressures, and the emphasis on, so to speak, rationality in personal conduct owes a great deal to prominent advocates of moral change in a non-religious fashion. These pressures towards moral change, which come from the United States, aren't normally associated with religious vocabulary and religious institutions, but they profoundly influence the United Kingdom, and one would obviously draw attention to, for instance, the spread of divorce. It used to be rather a joke when I was a teenager that American film stars were always getting divorced. Well, it's not a joke now because it's happened in the United Kingdom too. Psychotherapy and the whole range of psychiatric or psychological social services much less influence in the United Kingdom, but marriage counselling is certainly a notion that has come from the United States in the wake of the spread of divorce as an American concept. And the whole, I don't need to tell you, the whole movement towards research into sexuality owes an enormous amount to Kinsey, and later on, of course, to the Masters Johnson Sex Research Institution. Kinsey had enormous readership among schoolboys when I was a teenager in the United Kingdom, for probably the wrong reasons, but it was a profound influence on the whole move towards open discussion of sexual matters from the 1960s onwards in Britain. So America has a profound influence on the UK in the moral sphere, less through religious influences directly, more through sort of rationalistic moral influences, and nowhere more, of course, in the emancipation of gays. The whole movement towards homosexual liberation had started in Britain in the early and mid-60s, but gay liberation as a sort of overt style of pressure very much owes a great deal to the United States from 1970 onwards. So in the moral sphere, there's a complex picture of American influence on British conduct, but the influence is profound. If I move on to the fourth area, cultural aspects, I think probably one should start off by talking about population exchange. I don't need to tell you that there's a great deal of elite movement from the United States to Britain, among Henry James and others, from at least the mid-19th century, early 20th century, with another capture, T.S. Eliot, in the 1910s. But the exchange of population, whether permanent or temporary, has accelerated since that elite stage, and by the 1960s there were hordes of American bankers moving into London, the City of London, with the creation of the euro-dollar market and the establishment of American banks in the City of London in that period. And of course the tourist industry took off from the USA to the UK well before then, and it took off in the opposite direction from the UK to the USA after the late 1960s, when mass tourist packages got themselves established. So there's been an escalating exchange between the two countries in terms of population, whether permanent residents or temporary visits. And I should confess I'm an English to UK tourist with my wife, going on the buses this morning to discover the geography of Washington. There are many UK people, particularly when the currency balance is in our favour, who flood over to the United States. Nonetheless, between 1971 and 1991, there were always twice as many American tourists in the UK as there were UK tourists in the USA. The British were rather late to follow on in this temporary exchange of people temporarily visiting the other country. A second dimension of cultural impact has been, of course, through intellectual life in general. It doesn't cease to strike me how persistent the American connection is at the university level. Despite the fact that we joined the European Economic Community in 1973, you wouldn't have guessed it from the pattern of contacts with universities, which are still, on the whole, Commonwealth and American oriented. To a very limited extent, other European contacts. Student violence in the 1960s was a major factor in my own university and many others in the United Kingdom, which is puzzling, really, because students in the United Kingdom were highly privileged by American standards, and they didn't suffer from the major problem that American students suffered from at that time, namely the draft. We had no draft, and yet nonetheless the whole pattern of protest in the United States transferred to United Kingdom very quickly. The idea now of the mainline development of private funding of university, independence on alumni, is again an American import, very late on, from the late 80s onwards, I would say, and it's still growing very fast. Another example of American influence on the United Kingdom, and it's really the growth area in university affairs. Not to mention all the influence of American ideas in such subjects as medicine, where United States influences are enormously important. Everything that seems to be important to read about health seems to emerge from the New England Journal of Medicine. And you're always reading extracts from it in the British press, and the whole notion of health consciousness, which is a very important influence in late 20th century Britain, acknowledges the fact that the phrase beer belly first originated in the United States, and the attack on the beer belly is something that I assume started here. It certainly has reached the British people in the late 19th century who are frantically attending gyms and exercise places in the effort to remove their bellies. Sociology, of course, a profound influence. American influence on sociology is profound, usually driving it away from its original empirical emphasis in Britain towards theory. And certainly when I was a graduate student, talk at Parsons was the great guru that one worshipped at, but there were many others. C. Wright Mills, for example, major influence on British sociology in the 1960s and really changed the whole mood of the subject. I've already mentioned the Chicago School as an influence on British economics, the British economy. The Keynesianism was on the run in Britain from the 1960s onwards as a result of the Chicago School's influence, among other things, and of course applied science. And Britain has always been relatively weak in the applied natural sciences, partly because there's been a sort of rather Mandarin objection to the entanglement of natural science research with industry and business in Britain. no such embarrassment of the connection in the United States. And so with the growth of applied science in Britain, naturally American influences are very important, as are, of course, I should have perhaps mentioned this, in the area of business studies, under sociology. Business studies has been a growth area in Britain from the 1980s onwards. We've even got, after a lot of rows and ructions in Oxford, we've even got a business school of our own now, though it took an awful struggle to get it. And the American influence on that subject, I don't need to tell you, was extremely important. And the ideal of science parks was where industry and scientists cooperate together. Is again an American concept imported into the United Kingdom from the late 1980s onwards. So intellectual life is deeply influenced by the United States, but so has cultural life more broadly speaking. There have been occasional imports after 1945 from the United Kingdom. Architecture, for instance, in the United Kingdom is extremely prosperous for reasons I don't really understand, Norman Foster being the most striking example, and he may have influence in the United States. I don't know enough about it, but certainly as far as literary and artistic influences are concerned, the influence all runs the other way. That is, Oxford philosophy may have been briefly important in the late 40s, 1950s in the whole world of philosophy, but didn't last very long. Likewise, the Beatles may in the early 60s have exerted quite an influence in the United States, but again, it was a sort of freak, really. All the pressure came the other way in the world of pop music from the United States, and the same applies in the whole world of the media, really. Cinema, gramophone, radio, television I've already mentioned, computers I've already mentioned, and the fashion for the mid-Atlantic accent, which trendy people have always rather gone for in the United Kingdom, is something that originates the other side of the Atlantic. Together with certain rather unpleasant features in the media, I'm not entirely enthusiastic for this direction of influence. The phrase serial killer, for example, is a phrase imported from the United States. And overall, the glamorization of violence, which one sees in British television, particularly if you look at British television late at night, it's almost totally dominated by American programs which have done their rounds in the United States and constitute cheap source of entertainment late at night on the British media. Publishing takeovers are another area. From the 1960s onwards, publishing was increasingly dominated by the notion of the bestseller and of the actual manufacture of bestsellers through well-known business techniques. Again, a set of practices which owes a great deal to American influences. But there are also other recreational fashions, some of which I like and some of which I don't, as it happens. Bingo, skateboards, which I've never adventured into, but became really a fanatical phase in the mid-70s, and Halloween, which is extremely unpleasant. And when people appeared on my doorstep about 4 years ago, I said, I don't like it, go away. And they went away, I'm glad to say, but one can't be confident when people turn up on your front doorsteps wearing masks that they will go away when you order them away. But American fashion is profoundly important in the whole world of cultural life. Now, all that then, those four areas, the United States have been profoundly influential on various dimensions of British life, so to that extent there is a special relationship. It's a relationship which I've been talking about very much on the receiving end, the UK receiving influences from the United States. And it rests to some extent on our joint crusading, if you can put it that way, against the evil empire, against the Soviet Union. A distinguished historian, Roger Louis, has said that in practice, the Americans gave priority to anti-communism over anti-colonialism. They were so keen on the British to act on the frontiers to resist the Soviet Union that they, temporarily at least, except in Northern Ireland, of course, waived their objection to British imperialism and encouraged the British to stay in the field a little bit longer. So the United States did not conduct a sustained or continued attack on the British Empire after 1945 that it had conducted earlier. There was an undercurrent of hostility, but the first priority was, as Roger rightly pointed out, resisting the communist threat. And on that, the United Kingdom and the United States were at one right up to the end of the 1980s. And of course the Labour Party was as strongly anti-communist as, and in some ways more effectively anti-communist actually, than the Conservative Party in Britain, and in alliance with the United States in that sense. Nonetheless, I think this affinity between the two countries was a short-term affair, viewed in the eye of history, and a matter of not shared ideals, but of similar priorities. And as soon as the evil empire collapsed in 1989-90, that source of Anglo-American connection, of the special relationship, was blown apart. Even before then, it had always, this anti-communist alliance had always fluctuated in its intensity with personality. So the relationship between Churchill and Eisenhower helped to cement it, between Harold Wilson and Johnson, much weaker relationship, and it went into decline in the 1960s. Weaker also under Heath and Nixon in the early 70s, but Thatcher and Reagan restored it in its full strength to all appearances in the 1980s, and Blair and Clinton restored it again in the early 20th century. On the other hand, areas of considerable distance between the two, the personal weakening in the personal relationship is most evident during the Suez Crisis in 1956. Eden and Eisenhower did not get on, and likewise one suspects that Gordon Brown and Obama didn't like each other much either. So it fluctuated very much with personality, I think, as well. And one can't deny that even in the anti-communist period, but and well before then, of course, and always in Northern Ireland, anti-imperialism, American anti-imperialism remained an important influence on the United Kingdom, and an extreme area of embarrassment to the United Kingdom, though ultimately, of course, helped to produce the reconciliation that occurred in 1998. You'll remember that Mitchell was an extremely important figure in bringing the two sides together. The attitude of Tony Blair on the catastrophe of the World Trade Center destruction was almost instinctive identification with the United States, going really, I suppose, right back to the memory of the Second World War, which has remained a profound influence on British culture, political culture, but generally, I think, throughout the period since 1945, even at that late stage. When it really comes to the crunch, we stand together. And it seemed to me an utter tragedy that the moral advantage that the United States possessed at that moment was frittered away within 2 years. There's undoubtedly, it seems to me, a cultural affinity between the two countries, most obviously owes a great deal to their shared language. We've got no protection in the United Kingdom, such as the French have, in a divergent language. The American language is, broadly speaking, the same as the United Kingdom's language, and it removes a barrier that some other countries have against United States influence. I want to conclude because I'd like to leave plenty of time for questions, because I want to learn from you, with two concluding questions. First of all, why has the United States' influence been so powerful in the United Kingdom? I don't think there's any doubt that it has been enormously powerful, as I hope to show through these index entries I've handed round to you. First of all, it seems to me that the United States influence anticipates trends, really, which eventually become worldwide. It first espouses a number of developments which start off in the United States but are exported worldwide as prosperity and technology extends. And that's one reason why the United States is such an important influence on the United Kingdom. I remember when I was a child, I had a relative who used to take the Saturday Evening Post, and you saw a lot of pictures of cloverleaf road junctions in the Saturday Evening Post, and we thought that was an American peculiarity, and they went in for some reason went in for cloverleaf junctions. And, we didn't have any motorways, and we certainly didn't have any cloverleaf junctions. Well, we've got them now. Simply because of the growth of a mass car-owning industry and ownership, which makes that an essential component of getting around. So that it's not so much that the British have said, oh, cloverleaf junctions, what a wonderful idea. It's just that the same problem occurred in Britain rather later than in the United States, and so we adopted the solution the United States had come to rather earlier. So that's one reason why the United States appears to be so influential. It's because it gets there first, because it's the most highly developed society and hits these problems first. A second reason I think I'd be interested in your ideas about, but I think there is a certain culture in the United States which generates ideas. It's a combination of at least two things. First of all, the ideal of entrepreneurship, which we, of course, once had in the 19th century. We were once the workshop of the world, and the ideal of entrepreneurship certainly existed in the United Kingdom in the 19th century, but much greatly weakened in the 20th century, but retained in full vitality in the United States. That's a source of ideas. But a second dimension of ideas, idea-generating institutions, is federalism, of course. So federalism, you can experiment in one state, and the idea is if they're any good, they'll catch on in other states, and they'll be exported and adopted. Well, we've not had a federal structure. We're getting a bit closer to it through a devolved political structure since the late 1990s, but we've not had that source of innovation that you've had. Broadly speaking, I think federalism encourages innovation, although it also has a fragmenting effect. Fragmentation is in some ways creative in the United States, and we've not had that. The third reason why it seems to me America is so influential, why my index entries are so long for the United States in the two books I've written, is that America is rich. And rich countries, on the whole, absorb poorer countries. We are doing just the same to underdeveloped countries. We import our cheap labour from countries less opulent than ourselves, just in the same way as you've, for instance, pinched from us Tim Berners-Lee, the creator of the Internet. He just couldn't resist the offers of American money that dragged him across the Atlantic. Perhaps didn't even want to resist them. It's not so much that the United States influences the United Kingdom as that the United States is the first to generate ideas which catch on elsewhere, partly because they're good ideas, as I've said before, technologically good or imaginative or whatever, but also because they deal with problems that the UK, as a newcomer to affluence itself, eventually requires. But last and most obviously of the reasons why there is a special relationship as far as the UK is concerned with the United States is that we share very important moments in our history. and we share the same language, as I've said, and the barriers to influence, against influence, are very much weaker in the United Kingdom and possibly also in other English-speaking nations like Australia, Canada, and so on, than they are in countries with a different language. I've been impressed all the way through writing these two books on 20th century British history with the profound influence of the Second World War. The First World War still also, but the Second World War very much so, where rather belatedly the Americans stood with us and helped that we were both triumphant in 1918 and 1945. Will the special relationship persist? Is the last question I want to ask, and I don't think it will, for two reasons. First of all, to the extent that the relationship between the two countries is a political relationship, it has always been ultimately self-interested. The United Kingdom needed the United States, and the United States, at least early on in the century, needed the United Kingdom, even into the anti-communist Cold War period. That situation seems unlikely to persist, as the discrepancy between the power of the two countries widens, the United Kingdom becoming much less influential in the world, the United States at least retaining much of its influence, even though it may not be destined to survive to such an extent as previously, will mean that the special relationship, in my view, is doomed to long-term decline. But secondly, insofar as the relationship is cultural between our two countries, it's also doomed, in my view, because it originated, the cultural relationship originated in a shared language in a United States which owed an enormous amount of its population to people who arrived from the United Kingdom. There's, I think, one person, at least, in this assembly wearing a wasp tie, but I suspect there aren't many people who wear wasp ties because there aren't anything like so many of them in the United States now as there were 20 years ago, let alone 40 years ago, 60 years ago. British settlers in the United States are of diminishing importance proportionately, diminishing importance perhaps at elite levels. Settlers of Hispanic or African or non-UK European influence dilute the relationship to an accelerating degree. And of course, an anti-UK influence that was there from very early stage, the Irish, was already helping to erode British or to fuel American anti-empire sentiment long before 1945. But because the relationship between our two countries in this cultural dimension is rooted in what are still large and important areas of the United States, it's going to survive for a little bit longer, but certainly not forever.
Thank you very much, Brian. I can't tell you how refreshing it is to hear about the special relationship in its wider cultural dimensions rather than its more narrow political and strategic sense. And I think it's a remarkable accomplishment to get through an entire talk about the special relationship without mentioning Dean Acheson. This is truly something.
Well, Churchill was not the man he was in 1945 by comparison with 1940, but no, I took that as given territory.
Brian, could you speak?
I'm sorry, yes, I took that as given territory, but of course you're right, Churchill, I mean, you can tell me what his influence was in the United States, but one has the impression that he was aware, even in 1940-45, and really a very disappointed man towards the end of his life when he realized how the Americans were really top dogs. There's a question at the end there.
Yeah. Don Wolfensberger again with the Congress Project here. I picked up naturally on your observations about the Parliament versus our political system, and just two observations. I did grad school in the 1960s when one of the books I read was Bernard Crick's The Reform of Parliament. Another was James McGregor Burns's Deadlock of Democracy. And there was a thing among political scientists back in the 60s wanting to be more like the Parliament, for our Congress to be more like the Parliament. The two parties blurred. They were Tweedledee, Tweedledum. And this traces back to Woodrow Wilson, who, of course, who was a great Anglophile. But fast forward to 3 weeks ago, we had a book launch here for a book called Parliament and Congress by former House parliamentarian Charlie Johnson and his British counterpart, retired Sir William Mackay. And the interesting thing that came out of that was that the U.S., and Charlie Johnson's observation, it's been mine too, has become more of a parliamentary system in a lot of ways, at least within the Congress. The two parties are more differentiated, distinct, polarized, and so on. And at the same time, what came out from, and it was very kind of depressing, Charlie Johnson's observation about how they can't get anything done anymore because they are so much like parliamentary parties. But Mackay, on the other hand, was sort of very optimistic in saying, well, the British Parliament is doing pretty well now. The committees matter more. This is something Crick talked about in the 60s, about how they were evolving more into a U.S. congressional committee system that, even though controlled by the same party as the government, obviously, they were actually conducting more scrutiny of the government, something that we lack when we do have unified party government here. So, in any event, I just thought I would throw those observations out.
Yes, they're very important observations, if I may say so. I should have said that it always surprised me when I was reading about American comments on British politics that were written in the 1950s, how respectful they were to the British, the British parliamentary structure, and that's completely disappeared. I mean, we are looking to every country under the sun except our own for our ideas about how we can improve our political system. And it may be that the fashion for appropriating ideas from America has declined, but we now may be looking to some extent anyway, to Scandinavia, but particularly to European institutions with the idea of the multi-party system and proportional representation rather than the simple majority system, and also to the idea of the referendum or the initiative, which of course is a Swiss idea. I mean, we've completely lost the confidence we had, even complacency we had, about British political institutions as at the 1950s, when you quite rightly say a lot of American political scientists were saying, well, look, you've got a model across the Atlantic which you could adopt. Now, the reason why Congress is moving towards Parliament, which you interestingly say, is not because people have been saying, is it that there's a wonderful system over there across the Atlantic which you must adopt. It's just that the situation, the circumstances have changed to make the system less easy to operate than it was when parties had less policy content. I think the woman at the end has been asked, trying to get in there.
Bob Hathaway. I run the Asia program here at the Wilson Center. I would encourage you not to be quite so harsh on your own countrymen in terms of influence on this side of the ocean. I grew up in the 60s, and I arguably could argue that the most two profound influences on at least American males of a certain age in the 60s were Ian Fleming and then the British music, the British invasion, not simply the Beatles, but a whole host of groups, including, of course, the Stones, who are still influencing America. I recalled during your remarks the analogy, I think maybe it originated with Macmillan. I know that many of the mandarins in the Foreign Office subscribed to it at the end of the Second War, where Britain could be the Greece to America's Rome. Macmillan neglected to observe that the Greeks were slaves in that system, but Certainly a number of British officials for many years believed they continued to exercise influence on the United States.
Could I just interject? Did Americans actually go along with that?
No. And in fact, as you, of course, know better than any of us, I think it's probably true that with some exceptions, the Americans never believed in a special relationship to the extent and in the same way that the British believed in it. I once made a list of American special relationships. When I got to 20 or so, I quit counting. I've now forgotten most of them, but I remember that one time or another we had senior American official talking about our ties with Mexico as a, quote, special relationship, with Canada, with the Philippines, with Australia, with Italy, with Israel, of course. So that got me thinking, and this is my question, what's special about the U.S.-UK special relationship? Is it simply that these influences, these connections are deeper, more profound than, say, American ties with Canada or Israel or the Philippines? Is it alternatively the fact that, particularly in a security and an intelligence realm, we did things together that the United States didn't do with any of its other special partners? Or is there something else that, to the extent there was a special relationship, made this special even among America's special relationships?
Yes, that's interesting. I wouldn't presume to talk about the American side of things. You all know much better than I do how special the British relationship seems to be to an American. But if one compares, for instance, the special relationship between Canada and the United States, or Mexico and the United States, the distinctive thing about those two is that they're geographically contiguous. The interesting thing about the UK-USA relationship is that they're not. I mean, there's a huge distance between the two countries, and if a relationship can be established across a distance like that, that's something worth paying attention to. But then it's not different from the special relationship that exists between Australia and the United States. Now, I think that with Canada and their special relationship, I always have the feeling in Canada that basically they're in danger of being taken over. They don't want to be taken over. They're fighting the absorptive capacity of the United States all the time. I think there's an element of that also in Australia too. And there's an element of that in the United Kingdom, of course. The Conservative Party, one of the barriers to the American influence on the Conservative Party is precisely the reference you correctly made to Harold Macmillan's remark about the United Kingdom being Greece to America's Rome, that really we know better, we're more experienced. And, you know, these Americans come along, they're rough and tough and so on, but they need a bit of guidance. And so there's an element of that same sort of pushing away side in the United Kingdom special relationship as there is in Canada and I suspect in Australia. I don't know whether any such pushing away exists in Mexico. I suspect it probably does. So there's a similarity and a difference there, as between Canada, Mexico, and the United Kingdom, anyway, in that it operates over such a distance. As far as the Second World War is concerned, and to some extent the First World War too, then of course the bond, at least for 40 years, was profoundly influential on the British side of the American connection, and without the American connection we'd have been sunk twice, in my view, in 1917 and in 1941-42. And the British elite was very aware of that until really quite recently. So the special relationship as far as the UK is concerned, there's a great deal to that connection. Now, I suspect there's something rather similar with Canada too. A lot of the nuclear research, for instance, occurred in Canada, didn't it, in a triangle of cooperation between the UK, USA and Canada. I suppose the root, but you know more than I do about this, the Philippines connection is a wartime connection, isn't it? It was there before. It was there before, but it was a complete American takeover, really, after the Second World War. And to that extent, there's a similarity with the UK in that sense, though we weren't taken over in quite the same way. We weren't invaded, of course, by the enemy in the way that the Philippines were. But the Second World War certainly was a profound influence on the connection there. Now, I don't know enough about Mexico to be able to say anything fruitful. Clear that there's no it doesn't seem to me to be any Second World War connection there, but there certainly is a geographical frontier between them which diverges from the British situation. But I welcome any other comments that anyone else might have, because these are important issues.
There is a mythical dimension to the special relationship that can be traced to Churchill in particular, and it just proves to be remarkably durable. It just does not go away. Susan Crothers wanted to get into the...
Marjorie Sproul. Everybody mixes me up with Susan. I found everything you said very interesting. I think it's very unfair that you gave us my favorite show, the road show, the Antiques Roadshow, when we gave you bingo. That's really terribly unfair cultural exchange, I would say. I'm interested in your thoughts about modern feminism and anti-feminism in Britain, given that you've written so much about it at earlier periods. I didn't even know that British feminism was called fourth wave, since we don't use those phrases at all. But I was particularly curious about how the backlash against feminism would be alike or different, particularly because, as you say, the power of religion on politics has been so much less in recent years, and since religion seems to be what has fueled so much of the backlash against feminism in the United States.
Well, that's interesting. I wasn't aware of that contrast, actually. Certainly, an important dimension of the British feminism in the 1930s was the desire to get women priests. It was sort of next phase, moving on from the militant phase that led to the vote in 1918. But that's sort of, and that's still, they're still fighting on that front in the United Kingdom, and you know they're winning on the whole. I mean, obviously not in the Catholic Church, but in the Protestant churches, women priests is now, if not accepted in the nonconformist denominations, well on the way to acceptance in the Church of England. So that's a continuing strain that goes on from 1918 onwards in the United Kingdom. But